Hey everybody, welcome to another CS0 Intro to Java Programming video. In this video, I'm going to cover the basics of the item listener. We're going to take a look at how to create an item listener, how to use it, how to apply it, and then we're going to look a little bit more deeply into one of its states. So the first program I'm going to look at is ItemListener Basics. You should have this open on your computer as well. ItemListener Basics is going to be a frame that looks like this, where we press some radio buttons, and it's going to change the color of the background of the frame when we press a radio button. Let's take a look at the code. It is a JFrame, and it implements Item Listener. Item Listener is the listener that we use on the radio buttons and checkboxes, and many other things, but that's just how we're starting this. I've got a button group because, as you saw, I've got these three radio buttons that behave as non-exclusive or as an exclusive choice, where one is chosen, the other one is not chosen, and it does that by default. I've got three radio buttons, red, green, and blue. I don't need R4. I don't even know why that's on there. I've got my main method that does all the stuff main method always does. It's my basic GUI template. Item Listener Basics, I'm instantiating my frame. I'm setting the size on my frame to 400 by 100, setting my layout to flow layout, and creating my GUI and setting visible to true. Create GUI looks a little different. I'm starting to do something called decomposition. Decomposition means that when your methods get too complex, you modularize the contents of them. In other words, you wrap up some of the contents of a method into a support or helper method to sort of clean up the method. We also do this sometimes with chunks of code that we're going to use over and over and over again, like we normally do with methods. We wrap those up in helper methods and then use them throughout the class. In this case, I'm decomposing my create GUI because GUIs you're going to see are going to get very complex. By the end of this unit, our GUIs are going to be 200 plus lines of code, and we don't want to throw that all into the create GUI method. So what we do is we break the individual components down into their own methods, and then we call those methods in the create GUI. So we're starting that here. Default close operation, exit on close, and we get our content pane. And then I'm going to call on setup radios. This is going to be a method that I'm going to use to set up radio buttons for this class. So if we look at setup radios, it does all the stuff that we saw in the previous video on setting up radio buttons. I'm creating my radio group, and then I'm instantiating my radio buttons and setting focus painted to false on all of them. And then I'm adding them all to the group, and then I'm adding them all to the frame. Okay? And then lastly, I have to add the item listener to all of these components. So just like add action listener this that we did in the past, we're doing add item listener this. So we're adding the item listener now to our three radio buttons. So now all three of them are interactive. The program is listening to those buttons. Right? That finishes up our create GUI, which finishes up our main. Now, item listener, when we implement it, requires a method called item state changed. Much like action listener required action performed, item state changed is the method that is going to implicitly fire when an item event is detected from some component. So you may recall the way listeners work. When I interact with these three radio buttons, they're going to fire off an item event. And when that happens, the item state changed will consume that item event and use it inside through this parameter argument. Right? So what we are going to do is we're going to check the source of that item event. We want to see what one of those components actually fired off that event. Right? The way we do that is with getSource. GetSource is going to return the object of the source of that event. So if I interact with the green button, green is then going to fire off an item event. And that item event will come into here, into this method, and be stored in E. And then we can check where it came from through getSource. GetSource, in that case, would return the green button. If the green button were returned, we're going to check it here. E.getSource equals red. Well, if green button fired it off, the source does not equal red, so this would be false. We would skip over that. E.getSource is green. Well, if that's the green button, that will resolve to true. So we get in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the background color of the content pane to green. We're going to set the background of the red button to green. We're going to set the background of the green button to green and the background of the blue button to green so that the whole entire frame turns green. And then the last if, get source blue. Well, we know that the green button was the one was interacted with, so this one would resolve to false. Okay? So that's how ItemListener works. It works exactly like ActionListener, except in this case, we have 3 possible options. We've got 3 different radio buttons that we could be interacting with, okay? And we check which one was a source through get source. Now, ItemListener, as I said, is a little bit more complex than ActionListener. This one's kind of behaving just like an ActionListener. You might say, well, this doesn't look any different than the way a button behaves. All we're doing is checking to see when that happened and what one did it. And we did that with buttons. Well, let's take a look at something else. ItemListener has multiple states, and we're going to check in this one how isSelected works. All right, let's take a look at ItemListener Basics 2. ItemListener Basics 2 is a simple program that is going to be building up a string and drawing it to a label in our frame. And it's going to grow and shrink with whatever's checked. Okay? Now, this is behaving as non-exclusive choice so that all 3 of them can be checked, and we'll see that all 3 of them have been checked. So this one extends JFrame, implements ItemListener. I've got my 3 checkboxes. I've got a panel for the checkboxes. I've got a JLabel, and then I've got a output string. In the main method, I do the stuff that I do in main. I instantiate my frame, set the size, set the layout. I create my GUI, and then I set visible. Create GUI, you can see, is also decomposed again. I've got 3 methods in here: set up buttons, set up text, and register boxes. Because the GUI is starting to get more complex, I want to break it down into methods. Your methods should look clean like this, where we read through it and it reads very clearly. If I threw all of the code in here to set up the whole GUI, it would start to make my create GUI method pretty big and unwieldy, and I wouldn't like to look at it. So let's look at these individual methods. Set up buttons. Set up buttons is going to do everything that we saw in the previous video. I'm going to create a JPanel and store it in checkboxes. I'm going to set its layout to flow. This JPanel is going to be used to hold all of my checkboxes. And then we're going to add it to our frame. CH1, CH2, CH3, I'm instantiating my checkboxes, 1, 2, and 3 to them. I'm adding those checkboxes to the JPanel, and I'm adding that JPanel to the frame. Okay? This stuff is all kind of review. Let's take a look at create GUI. Next thing that happens is set up text, and here I am creating my JLabel, and it says text will appear here, and then I add that to the frame. And then last, register boxes. And all I'm doing is registering my 3 checkboxes to the ItemListener. So this looks a lot like everything we've done so far. Let's get into the way item state changed works in this case. As I said before, ItemListener has the ability to fire an event that carries multiple states along with it. We can check to see if the state of that checkbox was selected. We can also check to see if that selection event was if that item event was a selection event or a deselection event. And we'll look at that in a future video. But here we're just checking to see if they're selected. Okay, so we're going to check through here. An item event is going to happen. So when I run this, when I make a check, an item event happens. It comes into item event E. And what we're going to do here is we're going to just check and see which ones have been selected. We don't care what the source is in this case. We just want to make sure that if one of them has been, if an event happened, whichever ones are selected, we're going to add to the output string. Okay? We don't care which one did it. We just want to look at which ones are checked when the event happened. So if I click on 2, If 2 and 3 are selected, we want to get into those 2 clauses. If all 3 of them are selected, we want to get into all 3 clauses. We don't care who fired off the event, we just know event happened. So if ch1 is selected, what that's going to do is going to look at that item event and whatever fired that component, and if ch1 is currently selected, in other words, if it has a check in it, we're going to do this. We're going to concatenate check1 has been selected, or check1 has been checked, to the output text. And for each one of them that are selected, we're going to concatenate that little bit of string to the output text. So what you can see here is if all 3 have been selected, check1 has been checked, check2 has been checked, check3 has been checked. If only 2 of them are selected, check1 has been checked, check2 has been checked. If only 1, check1 has been checked. If none of them are selected, there's no output string added to the JLabel. All right? So the event happens, we check which ones are selected, we build up our output text by using concatenation. Now remember this syntax that we see here, output text assign equals that, is similar to output text gets output text plus some text. So what's happening here is it's looking what's in output text and it's concatenating this on to that existing string. So what will happen is if ch1 has been selected, it'll add this to the blank string. If 2 has been selected, it'll add this to that string. If 3 has been selected, it'll add this to that string and that string. Okay? So that's what's happening with these 3 lines. And then what we're going to do is set that output text to the label. And we've seen set text on label before. So output text, set text on the label. And then we're going to clear out the output text. What this one does here is it refreshes that output string. It's going to reassign it to an empty string. Because what I want to happen is every time I interact with it, I want it to refresh the string and it draws only which ones have been checked. Let's see what happens if I comment this out. If I don't refresh that string, you're going to see that it's going to get pretty big. So check 3 has been checked, check 2 has been checked, check 3 has been checked. That's getting really big. It's continuing to add on to the string with everything that's been there before. So check 3 has been checked, 2 and 3 have been checked, 1, 2, and 3 have been checked. That's too much. What I want it to do is just tell me what ones are currently checked. So by clearing out that output string, what it's going to do is it will build the string, set the text to the label, and then we'll just see what's currently checked. And then we clear out that output text so that next time we come through, we can see the current state. All right, so that's a little bit of how item listeners work. So as we saw here, the item listener works pretty much like an action listener. We implement it, we implement its methods, but then we have the ability to check and see which thing fired an event and which ones are selected. In future videos, we're going to take a look at these and see how flexible they can really be. Thanks for watching.